In today's video, I'd like to go over some important considerations for rows and rowing technique and why that's imperative to do well for handball players, not only for performance, but also for health. So first of all, any rotation movement, any rotational athlete is going to benefit from having a strong and mobile in the proper areas posterior chain. So that's all the way, from the ground up to the top of our shoulders. That's the posterior chain, and it's very involved in rotation. So if we're too weak back in our posterior chain area, any kind of link along the chain, if it's too weak, we're not going to be very efficient at generating a lot of rotational force. But what I'd like to touch on today, as far as rows and the rowing motion, is the importance of the upper back, the scapula, and why that's important for shoulder health. So the scapula, we want stable, we want strong, we want a strong upper back, but we also want that joint to be able to have some freedom of movement. Now, the reason I use the word stable is because we don't want excessive movement where the scapula are sitting where they shouldn't be. So if we're doing proper rows, horizontal rows or vertical rows, and a combination of them depending on your needs and maybe how the scapula sit on your shoulders, if we're doing those, then we should be pretty safe as far as scapular health, which is related to shoulder health. If the scapula aren't functioning correctly, if they're not moving well, and let's say they're kind of in a fixed position and we don't have the strength to develop the movement we need to then generate force into the shoulder, then what happens is the shoulder takes on excessive force, and it gets kind of hypermobile because we don't have much movement back here in our shoulder blades. So with that said, I'd like to run through a couple of very common mistakes that I see in rows, because sometimes we row without using our scapula, and sometimes we row keeping our scapula stationary. So you'll see that portrayed in a couple different incorrect movements. So I'd like to show you a quick demonstration on that. But first, here's what to look for. So the first one I'll show you is where people are too worried about rotating too much, so they stay right here when they row, and they actually glide forward slightly with the shoulder, and we don't get any pinch back here. So we just row here. So that looks like this. But now on the flip side of that, oftentimes people will make sure they really want to get that shoulder squeeze, and thus they're not letting the scapula freely move. So you see kind of a strange looking rotation where everything moves together instead of allowing the pull to then finish the movement with a squeezed shoulder blade. Now, of course, this is assuming that you also have the basics down as far as a flat spine and really kind of sitting back into your hip. Because if we're too rounded to begin with, or just kind of short with our body, then it's going to be very difficult to get a good rotation. With that said, we want to make sure we're spread out, we're sitting back into our hip, and we start the pulling motion by letting our scapula hang, letting that weight pull our shoulder blade down, and then initiating the pull with our entire arm, finishing it with squeezing the shoulder blade together at the end. So that's the one arm horizontal row. That's one example of a horizontal pulling movement. It's a single arm movement. So generally it's a little more complex, not that it needs to be, but those are the mistakes that you often see generally, if someone's maybe not coached up on them or moving in the right areas. Other options though, to make it a little easier before you get on to the one arm horizontal row, for example, are like chest supported rows. So where they have the machines where you just kind of lay on and support your chest and you grab the weight and let that pull. Or even if you're able to get into a good position for, say, a bent over row using dumbbells or a barbell. Now, again, I'm a big fan of pulling movements for any rotational athlete, not only for shoulder health, which happens in any rotation, but also for that performance of getting the posterior chain strong and using the right muscles to generate power. You know, we want to use big muscles to generate power, and then the small ones like the hand, or, you know, whether that's a swing, handball, baseball, golf, the hand kind of guides it at the end and snaps and finishes the movement. But the generation of the power, we want to be through big muscles in an athletic movement that's going to start from the ground up through the hips. But again, all that force is being generated through our posterior chain and up into our upper back and finally into the arm to finish the movement. So again, keeping our shoulders healthy, keeping the scapula both strong and able to move freely are really important considerations, not just for performance, but for injury prevention.